Hajime!
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, legionaries. This is General Lance, joined with you by Sergeant Barnes, my handle of whiskey, and Clark Savage. Welcome, Clark Savage. How are you doing?
Welcome. Good to see you again, Sergeant Barnes. Always good to see you.
Yes, he's very quiet. He doesn't like yapping too much. You know him. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on the transmission. I really appreciate it, especially because I've been a longtime fan. I admire you from afar, especially with your book, King of All Things, which is, by the way, I'll put a URL below in the description here, Legionaries. It's really great. I highly recommend you read it. Aside from that, I love your Twitter as well. But I guess I wanted to ask you, what was the main impetus for you to write that book, and what's the background about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the kind words, and I think we've been longtime mutuals now on Twitter, and appreciate having the chance to come on and talk a little bit. So about the book, it's kind of funny because I've done a couple podcasts now where I've talked about everything but the book. So, maybe it's time to circle back here and talk about the project here. I think the real impetus behind it was really kind of an aging process for me, to be honest with you, that started thinking about, as my training changes over the course of my life, and as you start to age, you kind of have to tweak things a little bit of, what you're doing in the gym, what you're doing with martial training and all that. And it just ends up changing on you as you age. You just can't do the same types of things exactly, or you maybe don't want to, especially injury and things crop up that you maybe throttle back a little bit. So I started thinking, at that point is when I really started transitioning to doing more Twitter and commentary. And this was kind of an extension of the Twitter, really, of trying to do more long form thinking about laying down some ideas of things that I've come across and people that I think are valuable, that should be remembered and maybe put together into one volume so that people have a one-stop shop for thinking about how they want to, whether it's themselves, their young, nephews, their sons, getting people involved in preparing for violence, basically. So that's really was the impetus there of sort of a transitioning to an older man.
Interesting, because I mean, here's the thing. I'm a much younger man, I guess. Well, not anymore. My hairline's starting to recede. Fuck my life. But it's a Caesar hairline, so I'll take it. I'll do the bright side about it. But the funny thing is, when I was a kid, there isn't really much, there's no book or movie that's kind of like a touchstone, a guiding path to discovering this kind of ethic, right? I'm lucky that my mom's a super hard ass, and she, got me into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when I was at the ripe age of 5. And, she's always been very, I guess, how do I say, like, in America, we have this weird ethic of peace and softness and whatever kind of disgusting communist shit. And ultimately, my mom has always been one to be kind of a hard ass and, not just stand up for myself, but others, stand up for what's right, even if you're alone. And the ethic that ultimately it comes down to force, having the force to impose good or evil and so on. And, it's been a lifelong search for me because this. The funny thing is, I think, in my view, um, man, most men are born to be followers. Very few are born to be warriors, and I think because of that small demographic, by virtue of that, and because we don't usually spend time writing, there's not much. There are not many resources outside of the military, which is highly technical, to get started. And so, which is one of the reasons why I love your book, because, and I bought your book for a number of my different younger, let's say, family relations. I don't want to give too much information, simply because of the fact that, I mean, it goes into everything, and I'm reading from the table of context now. It talks about big picture things from shore to crumbling shore, so big philosophical background to, of course, a canon as far as the base discipline of a warrior, so fitness, strength, the origins of such, and the Greek origins. And it goes on from there. I mean, it goes into a whole bunch of detail in martial arts, into physical fitness, into leaders, martial virtues. Even has this very interesting chapter of Christianity and war. And I mean, and especially, I think the most salient one, which I really resonated with you, was the chapter Modern Military Service. Now, I guess for you, I mean, do I mind if do you mind if I ask you, were you in the military? Like, what's your background as far as that's concerned?
Yeah, I'm a military veteran. I have a Marine Corps background, which I know I've talked about on Twitter, so I'm not really revealing anything there. And wartime service and global war on terrorism
Mm-hmm.
overseas, and that's sort of my basic background. A lot of the stuff from the book actually comes from that. Especially the sections on the leadership, the sections on some of the mentality of taking a martial mindset. The looking at things with a martial eye. That whole section is completely derived from military background, military experience overseas, and some of the other sections too. There's some firearms related things in there that definitely are. All Marines have a certain connection to their rifles and the sort of a way of approaching marksmanship and a way of approaching knowing your weapon and taking it apart. Definitely has a Marine stamp to it.
Kill?
And then, otherwise, most of my background otherwise is I was really into boxing when I was younger, and I did a little grappling too, and a little bit of MMA type training, but definitely much more experience in boxing as far as
I see.
unarmed things. So
And I mean, obviously, we're talking about the book, and I guess you writing it and stuff. I mean, does this come from a reaction to society around you? I know you have a lot of commentary, from Twitter about how things are, now, and I kind of wanted to get your perspective as far as the military's culture is concerned, how it changed through your time in, and how it's changed since you've gone out. And what are some suggestions you might have to either fixing it, or if you have any kind of wider American cultural critiques or like perceptions that you may have that you kind of are part of the reason why you have your project?
yeah, as far as now, I can't tell you much other than what I hear um, from people that are either still in or were out more recently than me, and it's pretty much all bad, is what I hear now. So, uh, there's always going to be things that you get from your military service, especially if you do it the right way. And I think there's right ways and wrong ways to do it regarding what you get into, and um, you know, there's a better and a worse way, but I think it's trending towards worse here, and the reason is because so many fundamental things have changed. Now they have, even the Marine Corps has co-ed boot camp. There's co-ed infantry, and that stuff wasn't around. And candidly, when if you're hanging around an infantry battalion 15, 20 years ago, it's was, you'd have some Mexicans in there, but it was pretty white. You're very few blacks even, especially actually infantrymen. You might get some in the admin sections and such, and in comms detachments and stuff. But it was very white, and there weren't any women around. And from what I understand now, it's changed pretty
Mm-hmm.
drastically. So you're going to get a completely different experience. Now the skill set you're going to get is similar,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, but uh, the nature of the leadership experience is going to be different. It obviously it's much more political now,
So I'm a
and I think
younger
we
buck
saw
than
that.
you, and just wanted to interject just before we move on. Um, you're going down that route because it's really interesting because I was there during the time when the Marine Corps when they were transitioning from all male, you know, I guess, well, technically speaking, it had been opened up to women for a long time, but because IOC was so tasking for officers that they had to, on numerous occasions and iterations, lower the standard a number of times, not just physical ones, but leadership wise as well. And ultimately, you know, well, I don't want to divulge too much because I also don't want to give away too much of my personal self. But let us just say that all the rumors of what would happen in that circumstance where women are out in the field with a whole bunch of dudes. It happened. It shook out basically exactly how people were saying it was going to shake out, and it continues to do so. And that was one of the concerning things for me, is because a lot of the standards are lowered. And I mean, I'm sure that you know this, but the majority of warfare is one of willpower and culture. And ultimately, when you add that to the dynamic changes. Leadership it's like there's a race to the bottom to compete over woman, as opposed to what a band of brothers do in a war, which is mutual assistance and assurance. And so the dynamic changes, morale plummets, and there's this kind of Byzantine weird vibe to everything in doublespeak. And it's unfortunate because, I mean, I know a lot of people that go there to escape that, to seek something that's truly, a calling. And of course, then it's kind of all the floor is taken out from that area because of that dynamic. And so I just wanted to aid what you're saying. It is definitely very bad, and a lot of people they ask themselves, is it hard to be infantry, or is it hard to do basic, military stuff? And I'd say no. What's difficult is the actual cultivation of the calluses, cultivation of the will, of exposure to danger, exposure to hardship, and persevering. And that is precisely what differentiates, the discipline of the undisciplined and the exception of the exceptional. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. It's as the culture changes in the military, then you're going to lose a lot of the things that draw young men towards doing that. And then plus you obviously have the problems because of our government, which when it gets down to it, what is someone that's in the military? They're a servant of the government ultimately. Um, and I think anyone that's listening to this podcast is going to have some problems with what the United States government has been up to in recent years, decades. So that's actually a chapter. The book was written like about 2 years ago, and that chapter is the one that you were referring to about military service towards the end. I was a little hemming and hawing on where I wanted to land on that, but now to be candid with you, people that I actually know in my life, you know, cousins and stuff that talk to me about wanting to do military service, I tend to say no. I
Mm-hmm.
tend to advise no, just because of where things have come out at this point. Uh, so, it's even in recent years, it continues to change and continues to get worse from my impression.
It is, and you're absolutely right. I think in general, if you're a normal person, I would recommend against it. I think I would recommend, if you are hell bent on doing so, going to, I don't know, the French Foreign Legion maybe. But I think you're right. I mean, unless you're someone like, who's patriotic even before that, who's, cognizant of the, for instance, they have a lot of these lectures now. They call it equal opportunity, but it's basically the same as the Chinese indoctrination camps during the Korean War, where it's based on self-crit and this kind of Marxian criticism. And of course, it's always aimed at, um, a certain ethnic group, right? And it's never it's very much, it's very caustic and bad, and the issue that it causes is systemic because people are afraid to uphold the standard, because of the ramifications of those standards being upheld against someone who's protected ostensibly by this Marxist kind of agency. And so, like, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, because if you're not careful, basically what you'll end up do is end up getting kicked out or in jail. And you see that recently with COVID. You see that recently with a number of different issues that are tangential to just one. So it's an all pervasive issue. And one of my main concerns, of course, is that this is being pushed by a subversive element due to the fact that it's a way of disarming us from within. And I mean, I know you've spoken a lot about communism before. I know you've tapered off and transitioned towards a new direction, which I agree with. However, I think for the purposes of this podcast, I would like you to elucidate as far as what you see as like a problem in the wider United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I see where we are as a country has been, it's kind of the ultimate landing spot of, the ultimate result and fruition of policies that have been going on throughout the entire 20th century, whether you're talking about immigration, whether you're talking about, this Gramscian movement through the institutions that the left engaged in the 20th century, where now, the level of indoctrination has been set in for a couple generations, and people are just bombarded with um, leftist kind of communist type thinking,
Mm,
uh, to the point where now we're seeing the results of that. Up and down any institution, whether you're talking about government, whether you're talking about the courts, as we can see from these recent Trump cases and some of the other high-profile cases, including some of these people that are being prosecuted, Perry and Penny and these others that are being prosecuted on these Rittenhouse
yeah.
on these ridiculous charges. You're just seeing the fruition of this is the system now that's been in place that they've been moving towards for generations.
Yep.
So, it's not something that can be fixed with a couple policy tweaks. It's endemic.
I completely agree with you, and it's one of the main contentions or points of argumentation I had with my fellow officers a long time ago, but also within my family, because I think especially the older generations, when you're a fish in water, you don't sense the water, right? And that's part of the reason why they do it incrementally and slowly, is because for them, what they call progress is a matter of course, that of course things will become more and more one way in one direction, nadir down. And so, when you're arguing with some people, it's very difficult to show them, how some things are just simply unacceptable. I mean, not even just unacceptable, but drifting away from the stated goal. And I mean, I think recently with in the 2020s have been one of the most pivotal years because I think they did it too fast. They started boiling frogs too fast and too hot, and especially with the iconoclasm of taking down statues. I mean, even if it's Thomas Jefferson, for instance, or it's the blatant propaganda with Netflix and the blatant what they call cancel culture, but what it is actually a Marxian Maoist practice, which is self-crit and something straight out of like Mao's culture war, which is to disenfranchise, to castigate people who are deemed reactionaries and counter-revolutionaries. And of course, that nowadays they use different terminology. So now they call it woke Marxism, and of course they call it racism, sexism, ableism, whatever it is that would be in the way ostensibly of a better future, a better tomorrow. And all that it's garnered is a further chasm in the middle. And for me, one of my main concerns is that I see patriots in America who are completely clueless and disarmed with a philosophy of life as a city to aspire to, if you know what I'm saying, right? Like, it's not just simply critiquing what is going wrong, but providing a framework of a vision of something to go and achieve, to progress towards. Because I don't think quote unquote progress and quote unquote conservatism is like, I think it's a psyop that we bought into. I think the truth is that we're working towards two very different things, and what they call us going up is bad. And so ultimately, that's what Lance's Legion is providing Americans and Western civilization a different vision of how things can go and how things can be beautiful. And I think that starts in the military, or at least it starts in the military ethos and a warrior ethos, and primarily leadership. And I'm sure you remember this from the Marine Corps, but leadership goes up and down the chain of command, and it starts with one man having integrity, having the moral fortitude, and the strength of will to try something different and new. I mean, what's your perspective on that? Hey Clark, I think we got attacked, but no. But in any case, I think this is all going to say that I think not everything is lost. I think the future belongs to men who have leadership and who have the skills to impose what is right. I mean, is that kind of what your take is as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question of what you mean by the future and how things, what can remain and what can survive and what can take different forms. So that's kind of a big can of worms. But um, at the end of the day, yeah, always in history, you're going to have people that are going to rise to the top because of their qualities, including their leadership qualities. And that's, I don't think, ever going to change. But particular civilizations obviously rise and fall. So,
Well, of course, and of course, I think history is replete with examples, examples of where civilization or a nation is imperiled, and there comes a man who not simply saves a country, but reimbues it with a kind of spiritual strength that previously had waned, right? And I think what comes to mind recently is Alexius Comnenus and the Alexiad, and how the Byzantine Empire was really on its back heels, and he just freaking, went crazy and just, you know, basically reconquered a large portion of the Byzantine Empire, which had been on the wane. And history is replete with that. I mean, there's Justinian II, and of course there's, you know, geez, I mean, counts immemorial. And I wouldn't want to go down that road as far as saying that the difference between success and failure, I think, comes down to the individual man of great strength and will, right?
yeah, I agree. I agree with that definitely. And there's a ton of examples in history of individuals making a significant difference. In fact, there's a whole body of um, historiography, the sort of great man theory of history about how individual people can have a disproportionate effect. And there's a way of looking at history where that's the prime mover, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
in human history.
And the
So
interesting
certainly,
thing, it bears out in a lot of sociological studies as far as unit, how do you say, efficiencies and scales of production, and that basically the 1% does roughly 50% of the work. The top 20% does roughly almost 90% of the work, or something similar to that. Legionaries out there who are listening, correct me if I'm wrong. However, I think it bears out in reality. And I mean, it is neither here nor there. But as far as a personal question, if you don't mind, what is probably the best book you've ever read out there, or the most impactful one, which made you want to go join the Marine Corps?
I don't think there was a book that made me join. It was more sort of intra-family type, without getting into it too much discussions. I don't know that there was a book that inspired me. But just to dovetail on what you just mentioned, I think Pareto, that's Wilfredo Pareto principle, isn't it? A power law principle, the 80% or the 20% are going to do 80% of the work. It's kind of a statistics power law principle that you see across a number of domains, whether you're talking about sales or whether you're talking about leadership, or whether you're talking about people within a unit that are actually getting things done, and or killers, for instance. The number of men getting killed isn't evenly distributed, or doing the killing is not evenly distributed throughout a unit. There's going to be people that perform better in any war, and that's been reflected out. So that power law principle, I think, goes along with, and it's very robust concept to apply to all of these things. That there are going to be fewer people doing more.
Hmm. You know, and this is why I kind of push back on this mass, this ideology of mass, which we've inherited from, of course, the Enlightenment, because of course we're in, the Masonic Revolution of '76 is an Enlightenment revolution, and I think we put a lot of emphasis on the masses when in reality it's cliques of elites who change and shape history. It's the less than 10% of the population which carries along the rest of it with itself. And just the reason why I harp on that so much, because people, they believe that just because they are outnumbered by many people, that somehow they can't win or impose their will or change the things that are going on around them. And I remind them, that famous quote, it's one man is 10,000 if he is best, and we aim to be 1 million, right? And so, I mean, like, it does really bear out, and which is part and parcel of why I love your book, by the way, is because it's learning those basic skills. An exceptional person can be armed with the knowledge to change the world for the better. And I think it's remiss of society at large to believe that peace is good, or that declawing people is good, or that necessarily seeking non-conflict, or even, you see this in like modern day like culture, like people, they're not even willing to argue with each other. They just call the cops, or worse, they get in a fight and they end up killing each other. I mean, is that your perception too?
Yeah, tying it more back to the book now, the idea there is that these are things that I think in our past we tied with being a free man. If you're a free man and not a slave or a serf, then you have to have some kind of contact with arms and some kind of capability to fight, and that has really died off now. As you progress in a civilization, you tend to produce more of this type that where it's completely alien. The type of person that can go decades in their life and they never even have sprinted, much less like thrown a punch, much less fired a gun, much less done any of that thing in anger.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it's normal now. So, and then you also turn into a spectator culture. It's happened to the classicals too, and I get into it a little bit in the book, that there was a shift from the um, Roman, from the Greek culture to the Roman culture, where sports and athletics went from being basically war preparation for free men to being a spectacle that professionals do, and that a slave-like commoner class just watches. And we kind of see that again, even now recently with MMA culture, where you get a lot of MMA commentators that, I have no real connection to it, and it becomes this sort of realm of of professionals where you're expected as a common person to just watch. Same with other sports is obviously too. It's probably even worse with the other sports, like the typical football fan
Yeah.
sitting on his couch, stuffing his
It's
face, is
disgusting. I think
so removed. Yeah, so removed from what's happening on the field that it does become a little disgusting.
it's not even just that. It's just disgusting. I mean, it's disgusting because it's the lack of self-awareness. I mean, I remember seeing recently, this video of this man. I don't even follow football. I personally hate football because the only sports that I actually like are blood sports, and it's, MMA, boxing, etc. And even then, I don't watch professional fights. Rarely do I. What I do like is doing them. And ultimately, there is a very big difference cognitively between, spectating, as you say, and doing it. I mean, and we see that even it's down to sex and what they do with pornography, which is voyeurism. And the worst thing that I think that has been caused by feminism, or rather Marxism in general, is this emphasis on non-conflict, on peace, and I don't know what you would even call it, but what it causes this malaise, which you have laid out, where men have become so atrophied with dealing with life itself, with conflict itself, that we just become slaves because ultimately we become so unaccustomed to acting in the world. And I mean, the worst thing I think that happens by consequence of that is that when bad men break the law, you have become so neutered that you have no you become irresponsible, right? You derelict in the duty of the Constitution, for instance. If someone breaks the Constitution back in the day, they'd hold you to account because they had the power of coercion to hold it against you. But who now has the courage to do that? Who now has the courage to not only act, but act without permission? And I think that is precisely what a warrior spirit is about not seeking permission, but acting in the world as it is, which is struggle and survival. And I think it bears out in reality how things are shaking out now. And I'm very sanguine about the future because I believe that there are men like you, there are men like many other on the internet, but in person, who are seeing that life starts with action. I mean, have you watched Fight Club by any chance?
Yeah, I've seen Fight Club.
Yeah. What's
It's
your
been a little while, but yeah, I think it's overall it's it's fine. It's I don't really have a problem with it. I maybe not as entertained by it as some others, but
Mhm.
um,
No,
I kind of approach film and movies in the same way that I do sports, in that it can be interesting, I can engage with it, but I try not to get too excited about it.
of course.
Um,
Of course.
there's that spectator aspect that I think we have to resist a little bit, of getting too immersed into like fandom of spectating. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I think what I'm just trying to get at precisely is that the good thing about stories, and I'm not telling people to be constantly watching TV or whatever, but what I wanted to get at is the story of a man who basically is in that same situation, that a spiritual torpor that comes from a consumer society where you're always spectating and living, and life is happening on the outside. And what it takes is ultimately having the courage to break with that, and I guess get in a little bit of trouble, get in a little bit of pain, a little bit of fortitude, and exposing yourself to that kind of stuff. That's where life really starts. That's where it really starts freaking pumping your heart, as opposed to you're just just floating through life. And I guess that's one of the most important things for me about jiu-jitsu or martial arts. And I you told me that your main background is in boxing, but I mean, it paints the rest of your psyche down to its core about the reality of life. If you're a fighting man, you perceive everything from that basic premise that there is an opposing force, and that the only way to see your benefit manifests is by overcoming that force. And I think most people don't feel that way. They think if we can just talk about our feelings and we can just find the correct mathematical solution, that somehow everything will be okay. And that's not the case. You know, the
Yeah.
cemeteries are full of men who were right and didn't have anything to back that up with. I mean, am I right? Do you think that's
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. I think it's correct. And I'll maybe highlight something about the book is I have a very pragmatic type of mindset. So the perspective that the book is coming from, what it's trying to deliver briefly is it's trying to be a reference for how someone, if they're a young person or they're a father or they are engaging with someone who, tends to be younger. It's hard to kind of get started in this way of life if you're a senior citizen, but what are you going to tell them and what are the references for them so that they can develop their mind and they can develop their skill set and they can develop the physicality involved in fighting and different types of fighting. And that's really what the book is for. It's a framework, and it's not about, acting like you're some kind of ultimate warrior walking through our society, but it's more of just sort of treating it as this is just something you need to do, and here's why you need to do it. And just like, someone that's operating a motor vehicle, their car, they should know how their car works. They should know, what the purpose of various things are in the car. And to me, living as a man, you have this body and this physicality, and there's a purpose to it. And part of that purpose is combat, and part of that purpose is fighting with other people, whether it's having to defend someone in your family when they're getting mistreated, or whether it's self-defense, or whether, whatever it is. So that's what the purpose of the book is, to a framework that can introduce people that maybe don't have this background and aren't sure where, they should start, or where they think their nephew should start or their son should start.
Exactly.
So that's where it's coming from. So, but, to answer the broader question, the whole thing, though, opens up a large door, which is that there's a legal structure here that is oriented against almost everything that you just said. Like, look at the example of, what is his name? Penny? I think his name is Penny in New York.
Mm-hmm.
The guy that he restrained the black guy on the subway, and then the black guy
the violent
had
guy,
a heart
yeah.
attack or something,
Yeah.
and then now Penny's getting charged or whatever. I mean, Penny was using, like, he didn't bust out a gun, right? He didn't even bust out a knife. There was no weapon involved. He restrained him with grappling techniques and basically put him to sleep. And the guy, because he was on drugs or whatever, died. So now he's getting charged for murder. So so part of the other thing that you have to think about when you're embracing this martial perspective is part of the thought is how you can approach these problems without hopefully unnecessarily landing yourself in prison too, to be thinking about that. And that's why we have different modes of combat that we have to talk about. If you just write a whole book where you're just talking about firearms, there's going to be times when firearms aren't wise, because you're going to, look at some of the famous examples in the last couple of years. The guy in Texas that was, he did maybe, I think his name was Perry, wasn't it? Like one is Penny, the other one's Perry, but the one that was convicted in Texas during the BLM riots, where somebody approached his car with a rifle, I think, and then I think he fired his revolver through the car window.
Yeah.
And was charged with murder and convicted of murder. So right when you start bringing guns into the picture, it's a whole different legal dynamic, especially when you start thinking of, it turns into sort of a Vladimir Lenin, whom discussion of, like, who is it that's shot, and are they a protected, exalted,
right? Are they my client
class? So so you might have to think about a different modality there, where you're just dealing with a problem where you have to use your hands, or maybe some other type of non-lethal weapon is something you need to think about. But that's
Hey, they keep on jamming our comms, so we're back. So you're just talking about, having different tools in your belt, your Marshall belt, if that makes sense. So if you keep on going with that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So really, what you have to have is ideally you're going to have different ways of approaching a problem, and I think where people get very stuck is they take an all-consuming approach of you get guys that all they talk about is guns, and and you see them and they're posting these videos of they've got their plates on and they're running around with the ARs
Yeah.
and they're doing different shoots and they're just talking about. But the reality is, are you going to need to solve all of the problems in front of you? Are you going to be able to do that with a rifle? And probably not. The typical if you're taking your family out somewhere and you have let's say you have an elderly mom or you have an elderly aunt or something and they're getting bothered by someone, you're not going to take care of that problem by driving home, getting your plates and your rifle, and then showing up again, right? So that's a problem that might require violence, but it's not going to be violence of that type.
Right.
Same thing on the other end. You get people that are hyper focused on BJJ, Muay Thai, and MMA focused things, boxing, and they act as if the whole world and fighting and everything revolves around, a an octagon, and that's not true as well either, right? So if you're Kyle Rittenhouse and you're trying to make your way through, what was he in Milwaukee, if I remember the
Kenosha or
or
something.
yeah, it was Kenosha. That's right. It was somewhere in Wisconsin or southern Wisconsin. So, and you're trying to make your way through on that night, and you got guys running at you with a Glock handgun, and you got guys trying to beat your head in with a skateboard. At that point, yeah, then firearms are the proper solution, right? But you have to have a varied approach or ability to have a varied approach, or you're going to have problems. You're going to land in prison. So, and we saw even with. I was talking about the New York gentleman, Penny, I think his name was, or was it Perry?
I
One of
think
the
it's
two.
Perry.
But so he's on the subway, then he ends up using grappling skills, and he chokes the guy out, the black guy. The black guy dies, and then now Perry's uh, under criminal charges, I think, for some variant of homicide. So. And that's a situation where he didn't use a gun or a knife, and here he is facing prison time too. So the legal regime, the overall point is, the legal regime is going to dictate certain things, unless you don't care about going to prison. So, and if you don't care about going to prison, then that's where you are. But I think most of us do, and therefore you have to have the ability to modulate. And the legal regime is always going to be relevant. Same thing on that leadership point. You could be the greatest man in history, but if you're not at least thinking about how you're going to approach things, then you're going to run up into a legal problem. And we see even currently with Trump and all this other stuff that's happening with these high-profile court cases, is that using the court system is a huge weapon of the establishment. So we have to be aware of that.
Okay, so I like pivoting right off of that is this concept that I constantly harp on, and I think Americans are uniquely, how do I say this? They're uniquely culturally deprived of the greater meaning of war and combat. Is that basically all of that is in furtherance of a political end? And what is a political end? Really, it's just seeing what you want to see in the world manifest, right? It's basically seeing your benefit manifest. And ultimately, you touched on this with, of course, civil disturbance and getting into fights that might land you in jail and prison. But no one considers, of course, that even the court of law is an arena of war, and that ultimately it's something I want people to get thinking about, because it's not just as you touched, it's not just about MMA or focusing on small unit tactics or whatever conventional sense, but it's also the understanding that these coercive tactics or coercion as such leads to political outcomes, and that ultimately it's also those political outcomes that we should be seeking to extend. And ultimately, I think conservatives really make this mistake. I'm not a conservative myself, I'm a patriot. It's different, and I think that ultimately conservatives need to start understanding that the law is an arena for war. It's not this impartial, weird contract bullshit. You know what I mean? And that
Yeah.
what's that implication is that, of course, you can take it over. You can make the court work for your favor. You can also hold, the friend-enemy distinction, which is a massive teaching of the warrior, which is this, is that, everyone who helps me in my ends are my friends. Everyone who, is in the way is a different shade of enemy. And to see the world in friend-enemy distinction, Carl Schmitt or whatever, is really helpful because you are disarmed if you are, and I know that you might disagree with me, but if you are a Christian and you believe that everyone has a certain soul, or they have a certain protection that they must be given, or extended rights or something, or like if you're a liberal or communist, you believe that everyone is part of the same hive mind and that ultimately no one's anywhere different. But I think that's wrong, and I think that you see this being borne out with the communists in power, is that they are ruthless about making sure that people know that they're on either their team or the opposite team. And I guess that's kind of why I want people to really get in touch with the warrior dynamic, because implicit in that understanding is the friend-enemy distinction. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's important, I think, to have a different framework. Now, that said, I think you can disagree with it. I don't. I agree with it, but I think you can disagree with it and still get some benefit from, I think conservatives, for instance, which I'm not either, can get benefit from learning martial skills. But I think at the end of the day, if you are thinking about what is the purpose of what I'm doing with my life, and once you take a look at things from a political perspective, you're always going to fall on the fact that the friend enemy distinction is important, it's vital, and it's central
Mm-hmm.
to any effective way of combating the regime and system.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. I think, and it's part of the reason why at Lance's Legion, like, I go into the political science. I go into, Machiavelli and how to govern, how to administrate, all the things that are, a total human being. And I think that's why, in my heart, I believe that warriors are a total human being, because you can just see the breadth of knowledge required to master even just the basics. For instance, conventional arms, as well as, of course, mixed martial arts, and of course everything downstream from that, politics and governance and so on, and philosophy. And I think it should be telling to those who are listening that people like Putin, for instance, who is himself a great statesman, and I don't think I've met anyone who has said otherwise, whether you like him or not. He's a Sambo freaking black belt. You know what I mean? This guy's like super good at what he does, and I think it bears out that most of history's greatest men are the world's greatest commanders and warriors. I mean, like, do you have any in your mind that kind of point out as like, I guess, paradigms of adulation personally for you?
Yeah, I put a few in the book itself towards the later chapters, but I would say if one jumps out, since we're having a political discussion, like the one politician that jumps out that I think is maybe a little different than the others is Andrew Jackson,
Mm-hmm.
um, because he's not only, we've had several presidents obviously that have served in different wars, starting with our first president, but uh, Jackson, I think, was the only man that killed a man in a duel. I think he's the only president that did that. And he not only served in a war, but he had volunteered for uh, the Revolutionary War when he was underage still. So I think he was 13 or 14 at the time. Um, so he, was a Tennessee, Tennessee when back when it was frontier through and through, and was really probably the model of the warrior ideal. There was an assassination attempt on him too, where I think he ended up beating the shit out of the guy with his
Oh
cane.
yeah, I remember that. That was
Um,
awesome. And he's dueled a number of men who were discourteous to his wife, to say the least. And he killed a number of them too. I think that was pretty awesome. I mean, what's your, we should bring back dueling. What do you think?
yeah, dueling is an interesting thing. Uh, it's sort of a vestige of a more barbaric time where sometimes I haven't done a whole lot of this recently. I did actually the other day when I was talking about Billy Budd on Twitter, but there's a tension right between uh, honor, which is a very barbaric at its root concept, and civilization. And as your civilization goes, and you saw that with the Roman civilization, you see that today, the Western civilization, that as the civilization progresses, the sense of honor kind of necessarily diminishes. And with that, what is a duel? I mean, it's the ultimate expression of honor, right? It's a personal insult. It's an attack on your personal integrity as a man that gets violent
Mm-hmm.
payback. And it's a formalized, kind of ritualized system where it's a fair fight, and it has this sort of very Aryan trappings to it, where you're not ambushing the guy and paying him back or whatever, but you're meeting openly according to pistol rules or dueling sabers. But the that is a system that the only vestige of it that survives today, and I think that's dying too, is the schoolyard fight,
Mm-hmm.
where kids fighting in school. But I think they've cracked down on that so much, this last generation, that I don't even think it happens that much anymore. But that's probably the last real vestige of it, and I don't even know what people would do if you. I guess there's another exception I would say, and that's, which I applaud, which is this celebrity boxing stuff that's been going on over the
Yeah.
last couple of years. That I think it's a good expression, because I think once again it reminds you that violence is a part of life. So if you're running your mouth at somebody else, that even if they're not going to come and kill you and split your head open, at the very minimum, if you have to face getting in a ring with them,
Yeah.
then that might sort of change your course of conduct. And we've gotten to the point now online where routinely, like you've seen this, you spend any time on Twitter or X, you're going to see people saying the most obnoxious stuff to each other, because there's zero repercussion for it, like physical repercussion for
Mm-hmm.
it.
And
So I'm kind of glad that culture's come back a little bit, of calling people out and fighting.
the corollary is interesting, is that they told us, or at least they told me when they tried brainwashing me and my peers, that if you're just peaceful, man, like everything will be fine, and basically we're seeing that that was just a ploy and manipulation. And Nietzsche talks about this. He talks about how the slave caste, they utilize cleverness and emotional guilt and manipulation in furtherance of their personal power. Because now you see all these pencil necks in power that are malicious and insidious in their various forms. And to me, they're not they're not even really that clever. I mean, I don't know, dude. Like, it's very easy to see their mind games. I'm kind of immune to it. But the thing is, it's just so powerful to people who are normal, especially women, who are more like effeminate, and basically they believe that if they can get guilt tripped into everything, and then they get like suckered into it. And I think really it was the social engineering of trying to get people to be peaceful, to make way for people like that. It was just a way to stop getting stomped on. Because back in the day, you conned someone, you got shot in the face. You know what I mean? That's why Americans don't know why American culture is so polite. The reason why we're so polite is a vestige from the frontier culture, where basically, even slights of honor and considerations of cheating or not holding up your word were grounds enough to be killed. And you relied very much on your neighbor for mutual survival, especially out in the frontier against whether it's Indian raids or interscene conflict or even just the wildlife itself that was untamed and powerful. And ultimately, I believe that there's no such thing as honor culture going away or coming back. It just simply, just like a muscle, it atrophies or it strengthens. And that I think the reason why Americans are slaves to the world is because they have no sense of self-worth, self-honor, self-love. And basically, that is why they're such good slaves, and why they're so depressed, really, at the end of the day, and why things are kind of falling apart. So I completely agree with you on that, and I think that your book has done wonders, especially because I have some younger friends, and they've read your book, which I'm very grateful for, by the way, that you actually took the time to sit down and write it out. But if you have any like parting advice for the younger generation coming up, what would it be?
I would say that the overall advice would be that you have to be careful to not get ensnared into systems that you don't want to be in bed with. So, and this ties in a little bit to the fighting, but I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here. The first thing being the people get sucked into a particular, they figure I got to make some money, and they get kind of pulled into a certain type of education or a certain type of job, and then they get sort of sucked down that road, and then these physical aspects to life become just flushed down the drain because guys saying, well, I'm day trading stocks, what do I need to know about, why do I need to show up at my MMA class, or I'm in a line of work that has nothing to do with it. It makes it has no connection to my life. I don't see what the cost benefit is. Or they get sucked into systems, including being on Twitter and being on social media and being on where you get pulled into these very artificial things that are separating you from your core manhood and your so I caution people to be aware of that. And the reason why it's important, again, comes down to when it rubber meets the road on something, you're going to fall back on these skills, right? So when sooner or later, if you have something in this world, that means you're going to have something that can be taken from you. That means you have something that needs to be protected. If you have nothing, you have no property, you have no family, you have no, then, maybe you can skirt by that way, but that's not what most people want, right? They want to have something, whether it's family, property, money, whatever. And those things can be taken from you. And the way that you can prevent some of that being taken from you is your capability to engage in violence.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have, sort of a baseline skill to, just like being able to prepare food and basic skills, hygiene skills, that you just need to be able to do these things. You have to devote at least some time to doing it. So that would be my general advice, is that you have to spend some time and energy in the physical realm.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't, I think it's very, because I see this as an older person in myself, that sometimes I feel like I'm spend too much time on fucking around on X today. Need to get back to doing some other shit. So, because it can turn into a time suck. And I think it's even worse for people that are doing other artificial things. Maybe they're doing video games. Maybe they're doing, day trading, like I was talking about. And they have these kind of artificial, very abstract connection to life in the world. And I think at some point you have to have the physical connection. And that's something that you're always going to fall back on. And it's always going to be needed sooner or later. And it's just important to be able to pull away from those things and not just be purely abstract person and getting into weights and getting into fight training and getting into firearms are all ways to do that.
I think that's awesome, and this reminds me of one NCO that I had, and he told me that my job is really easy to understand. It's hard to do. And I think that's applicable not just to, of course, infantry, but I think it's applicable to life. Because ultimately, people mind fuck and they think that life is a lot harder than it is when it's really simple. And you know, I think a lot of the young generation, because everything has become so abstract and ephemeral, that ultimately they're deprived of actually engaging in it, and that ultimately these proxies, which you allude to, which is X or video games or whatever, is not life. I'll be honest with you, it's not life. And I say this as a young dude who's been on the internet, who plays video games, who's had since I was a young kid, who's had these time sucks on my life. You have to recognize it as like uh, like alcohol is. You know, you can drink a lot, but you know it's going to take its toll. Ultimately, I think the important part about living life is that you're living as a person in reality, engaging with it, and embracing pain. I think that's the most important part is
Yeah.
embracing pain because life is pain and people think it's going to be a euphoric experience the entire time that if it's not a gravy train then it's wrong and bad or worse if it's just numb or something that's somehow life. I couldn't I can't urge you hard enough to run towards pain because I promise you if you run towards pain your life on the other end will be a lot better and the peaks of euphoria will far exceed anything that some meaningless freaking twig has ever told you has any meaning. So ultimately, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Clark Savage. You have been such an important cultural impetus out there, but also, such a good dude. Really appreciate it. And for those legionaries who are listening, just check out Clark Savage. I'm going to put his Twitter handle below so you can get at him. But also, just thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good night and look forward to seeing this get posted. But good luck to you.
You too, sir. Thank you so much.